Hey, what's going on? This is the Body Punch Podcast, and my name is Naz. Let's talk about UFC 266. I'm recording this podcast hours after the main event finished, so it's fresh in my mind. And after watching a couple of the interviews, a couple of the other podcasts out there, seeing the overall consensus on social media, it's turning out to be one of the greatest featherweight fights in UFC history. And it might be in MMA history on top of that. And the reason isn't because of some domination by either fighter. It was the back and forth nature and the way that Alexander Volkanovski was able to get out of adversary. He popped his head out of a triangle choke, a guillotine, and never even thought about tapping out. It was funny because he talked about it in the post-fight press conference and in other interviews he did. The fact was that he was like, I'm not giving up my belt just like this. I'm not giving up my belt by getting tapped out by Brian Ortega. And that's what he did. The resiliency, the resolve that he showed in that third round, might have been the third round, the second round. The whole fight was amazing. But the way that Brian Ortega was just coming forward and reminding us of like a zombie or something. Funny enough, he fought Korean Zombie before this fight. But it reminded us of the Max Holloway fight where he was getting beaten. It was up there in all-time strikes thrown. Not like the Calvin Kattar fight where Max Holloway really put the pedal to the metal. But Brian Ortega was game and he was ready to fight. And after some of those attempts that he threw, which seemed like Hail Marys near the end of the fight, and he was just laying down there on the ground, and his corner had to pull him up and pull him onto the stool. It just looked like he spent everything that he had. It just looked like he threw everything he could throw. All the punches, all the submissions, anything. This guy is known for his submission game. Training under some of the greatest submission Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructors in the world from a very young age. And also being involved in mixed martial arts at a very young age. Not just starting off in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but also doing other disciplines and mixing them all together, but very well known for his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Obviously, his name is T-City. And for him to throw up a triangle choke, a guillotine, and to strap it on as quick as he did and how tight it was. Volkanovski talked about some of the noises that he was making when he was in that guillotine choke. It was like a gurgling sound or something like that he was making. And for him to still wait it out, wait for a little opening to catch his breath, shows the type of training that he does, shows the type of training that everybody in Australia and the New Zealand region is doing. It's kind of reminding me of the Canadian MMA scene at one point. At one point, a lot of things were getting funneled through Montreal and a little bit of Toronto, but it was a lot of it was being done by TriStar and they were all collaborating together and creating an amazing Canadian MMA scene. Obviously, it's a little bit different now, but what New Zealand and Australia, what they're doing and collaborating together, Eugene is bringing a lot of those fighters together. Israel Adesanya, Dan Hooker, who was also on the card, we'll talk about him a bit later on. And then to get Alexander Volkanovski, who is he's a member of that team. He obviously trains in Australia with his team, who need a lot of credit given to them. But what Australia and New Zealand, what those fighters are doing and collaborating together is amazing, spectacular, and it just boosts everybody else to a higher level. And what Alexander Volkanovski showed us, it was what he was talking about throughout the whole fight week, which was when you fight him, you have to think at all times. This is not something that you can do just automatically. Compared to other fighters, Volkanovski and his team have developed an amazing striking system. They work on their Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They work on their ground game all the time. And you can tell, obviously I'm not there watching them all the time, but you can tell that they train at a pace that's almost like game speed. Like in basketball, they say that, are you training at game speed? And it seems like everybody there at City Kickboxing, even though Volkanovski didn't train at City Kickboxing for this fight, a lot of those tendencies are rubbed off and given to Alexander Volkanovski and given to his team. Everybody in that region, everybody that's training with Eugene, everybody that's working with the team out there, they just have that special style that they present, and this tactical style that has a lot of people confused. But give it up for Brian Ortega. He was able to take it. He was up there. He talked about how he is in almost the three-way horse race for that belt between Max Holloway and Brian Ortega. I think that Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski have just gone to another level, honestly. They've almost lapped some of the competition in the featherweight division. Poor Brian Ortega, he gave his heart and soul to the past couple matches that he's had with these former champions and champion in Alexander Volkanovski. That he just gave it his all. But unfortunately, there's still some things that need to be worked on. There was a lot of damage taken. There was a report given out. There was a tweet given out by Bronstetter from TSN. He talked about how Brian Ortega has taken over 500 shots to the head, major significant shots to the head in his last 2 fights. And in the last 5 fights, that's the same amount of shots that Alexander Volkanovski has taken. So you can see that there's a drastic difference in the levels of striking and in the levels of, obviously, the jiu-jitsu game and the ground game. Brian Ortega is working and keeps hustling and grinding in those aspects of the sport. But what a way to showcase yourself in Alexander Volkanovski doing what he did. What he did there was he showed everybody that he belongs. He has a seat at the table when talking about Jose Aldo, Max Holloway, and some other featherweight greats. he has a seat at the table there. A lot of people had, I would say, a bad taste in their mouth when the favorite Max Holloway was defeated in that match. So a lot of people had a little bit of bad taste in their mouth. That, you know, obviously he's an amazing fighter. Max Holloway is. He's done some amazing stuff. Keeps doing amazing stuff after that fight. What he did to Calvin Kattar was spectacular and broke so many records. And to do it on that stage, that was that ABC card, if you remember, in Abu Dhabi. And it was one of the first cards that was held on Fight Island. So I've talked about it multiple times on this podcast, but the pressure of flying all the way out there and doing what you do there is something, it's difficult to even think about what Max Holloway did. But back to Alexander Volkanovski's seat at the table, like I said before, he has cemented himself as one of the greatest fighters in the UFC currently. This is not something that a lot of people put much thought to, in my opinion. Not a lot of people talked about how great Alexander Volkanovski is. And for him to do what he does out that 145-pound division and the potential matchups that are coming up with Yair Rodriguez and Max Holloway fighting against each other. We could have Max Holloway, Volkanovski Part 3, and we could have Yair Rodriguez versus Volkanovski, which would be an amazing striking display, amazing fight itself. And I'd love to see both of those fights, and that will push us forward in this 145-pound division. So that was that one. Alexander Volkanovski defeated, Brian Ortega, unanimous decision, 49, 46, 50, 45, 50, 44. A couple of people had some thoughts on the unanimous decision, but I mean, it's a unanimous decision win. Alexander Volkanovski got it done. And let's talk about the next fight. Next fight, that was right after or right before the featherweight bout, was the women's flyweight fight. Now, I'm just going to talk about a couple points here. Obviously, this was just this is what everybody thought would happen. Give it up to Lauren Murphy at one point. I did think that it was going to go to decision. I think that Valentina Shevchenko is a little bit of, she's so good that people are giving her unrealistic expectations. For people to think that in the first round, automatically the first punch that she throws, she's just going to knock out her opponent. That is not the case. Obviously, she's going against trained killers out there. She's going against the best of the best. And in the UFC especially, it's always tough competition. Give it up to Lauren Murphy. She was able to defend herself, able to throw a couple things, but it just looked like she was a deer in the headlights for this fight. It looked like Valentina Shevchenko just did what she does best and reacted to everything her opponent does and TKO'd her. And what a vicious combo near the end of that fight. That's something that we see a couple times in the UFC and in MMA general. I've seen it in the UFC a lot, but when a fighter gets wobbled, their hands are down, and then that left leg comes up and smacks you right in the face, and you get even more wobbled. That end sequence that Valentina Shevchenko threw was crazy. And kudos to the no-nonsense Keith Peterson to stop that fight. That fight needed to be stopped. And then there was Robbie Lawler versus Nick Diaz. You know, I think about this fight. A lot of people have mixed opinions about this fight. And my thoughts are just that I came in to this fight with very low expectations. We've seen a lot of these fights, a lot of these veteran fights, a lot of people coming out of the OG league in the UFC and boxing, anywhere. And they just have some horrible, horrible comebacks. And I think what Nick Diaz did here, he showed that he had a little bit left in that gas tank. He showed that he belongs there with a fighter of Robbie Lawler's caliber. But this was not the same Nick Diaz. The combinations, the boxing combinations that Nick Diaz was throwing were crazy, going to the body. Not a lot of people ripped that body like the way that Nick Diaz was doing. Very boxing-esque. Wide open. He was really putting all of his power, ripping that body. And that was great to see. The combinations that he was throwing, they reminded me of some of his old fights. The combinations, the very pitter-patter style. It's funny because the first fight that Nick Diaz and Robbie Lawler had, some interviewer was asking Nick Diaz and saying that, who do you think is the greatest KO artist in the UFC at that time? It was UFC 44 and it was 2014 or something like that. So the interviewer also adds to the point. He says that I know that you're not a KO artist, so I don't know if this question pertains to you. Obviously, someone that doesn't know much about the sport, he's correct in the fact that Nick Diaz is not a KO artist, but he's funny enough that after a slap combination, and let me repeat myself, the combination almost started with a slap. Nick Diaz took out Robbie Lawler. It was a TKO. It wasn't a straight KO, but if memory serves me correct. But it was funny to see that. And why I bring that up is because I think a lot of people watched that old fight. I'm assuming that it would have came out near the lead up to this fight. And people saw that and thought that, hey, maybe Nick could knock out Robbie Lawler. Obviously, we all know the power that Robbie Lawler uses and has used on multiple occasions in his championship run, in his UFC run. So we know that Robbie Lawler has that power. But I think a lot of people forgot about the fact that the Diaz brothers, it's funny I'm saying this because Nate Diaz almost knocked out Leon Edwards in their last fight, but they use cardio at a pace that brings their opponent into deep waters. This is not something new that I'm bringing up. This is something that a lot of people already know, especially if you're listening to a podcast like this. This is something that a lot of us know, and the Diaz brothers don't have that powerful single shot to take out their opponents. So what we saw here was almost vintage Nick Diaz. I bet some of the combinations were a little bit unorthodox, but it just goes back to that old school style that Diaz has. Robbie Lawler looked great in the fight, very aggressive in this fight. I think that's the way that he had to do it. He had to be in the face of Nick Diaz, not give him an inch. He was just stalking down Diaz throughout this whole fight. And it was crazy to see. The whole fight, Nick Diaz was just backing up, putting his back up against the cage. Something that the commentators alluded to was him backing up and countering a lot of his opponent's shots is something that he did in the past. But was it the best game plan for a fight against Robbie Lawler, who is being ultra aggressive, going for broke in this fight? Who knows? But let's go to the main part of this fight. at the end, Nick Diaz retires in the third round. He didn't want to get up. Originally, it looked like it was a nose injury. Then it turned into a leg injury. There was some sort of bulge on his leg that I saw. So I assumed that it was a leg injury. He was holding his leg. And then he just popped back up. He popped up like nothing happened. So maybe he just took the L. He didn't want to fight anymore. And that is not something that we are accustomed to seeing in either of the Diaz brothers. Both of the Diaz brothers keep going. I remember the Masvidal fight recently for the BMF championship. Nate Diaz wanted to keep going, but the doctor had to stop that fight. The doctor had to stop that fight. He was bleeding so much all over the place, and there was a nasty cut in an awkward place. I think it was on top of his head or something like that. But the doctor had to stop the fight. Nate Diaz was really protesting that stoppage. But you could see the Diaz blood running through his veins. He didn't want to stop that fight. And for Nick to wave off the ref, he put up his hand. And it was very sad to see, to be honest with you. This is not something that we're used to from the Diaz brothers, like I mentioned before. It just time is the ultimate winner in all this. The time that Nick Diaz took off between his two fights. I'm just going to go to his record and get the exact date, but his last fight was against Anderson Silva, January 31st, 2015. And then he fought September 25th, 2021. And even in that fight, we all remember when Nick started laying on the ground, and it confused a lot of us. Nick didn't seem the same in that fight either. And for him to come back and, the unfortunate events, the reason why he was suspended for such a dumb reason, and for him to come back and not look the same, and you could see the years taken away from him, the years that could have been spent fighting and making money. It was just it was tough to see. But at the beginning of the fight, let's just recap this. At the beginning of the fight, I will say I was impressed by Nick Diaz for the time that he was off, for the event that he was in. It was a big fight feeling, especially during COVID, one of the first Las Vegas packed houses in the T-Mobile Arena. And it was in the moment, at that point, Nick Diaz was looking great. At the end of the fight, it was sad to see him retired like that. Kudos to Robbie Lawler. The game plan that him and his team used in this fight was first class. The fight for these two veterans to have a slobber knocker like this, almost technical slobber knocker, but it was a fun fight to watch. And I think Nick Diaz, I would love to see him go to boxing, have an Anderson Silva type career, but I think he needs to get some of his inner circle and all that behind the scenes stuff figured out before he fights. This is something that he mentioned in the post-fight interview after the fight. And let's quickly go through the rest of the card. That was the main ones, the main fights in the main event, the three main fights that this card was made for. Jessica Andrade beats Cynthia Calvillo. TKO punches Cynthia Calvillo. Both of them look good, but my only thing is that it's tough to make these kind of fights because flyweight is so. They're looking for someone to take on Valentina Shevchenko. We need someone to say that, hey, this is a good challenge for her, and she doesn't have to go against Amanda Nunes again and again and again. So Andrade wins that one, sends Calvillo back to the back of the line, and we'll see what happens next for that one. Um, Dvalishvili, what an amazing fight against Marlon Moraes. Magic Marlon Moraes showed us some magic in that first round. And then all of a sudden, Dvalishvili, he just came back. The resurgence, the cardio that he has, and this is something that we mentioned so many times about him, is that the weaponization of cardio that he has, how scary he is to fight. For him to come back and defeat Magic Marlon Moraes in the second round was spectacular. One of the greatest things that I've seen, and it's perfect that he got a $50,000 bonus for that fight. One of the greatest comebacks ever, especially against Marlon Moraes. If you think about it, this is a guy that has done it all. Won belts, knocked people out in spectacular fashion, a scary fighter to fight. And for Dvalishvili to take him out like that after facing that adversary, he was on the ref was about to end the fight right there. It was really going to be over. But right when the referee said you got to do something, he showed something, and he was able to get the win, the TKO finish in the second round. Now, this is a big one that I wanted to talk about. Dan Hooker versus Nasrat. Dan Hooker having a bunch of visa issues, talking about it. It was a big story. Flew in on Thursday, weighed in on Friday, fought on Saturday, and now going back next Sunday. So what a timeline both of these fighters had. Nasrat going through the unfortunate event of losing a very close family member, and him also having some visa issues and stuff like that. But Dan Hooker, for him to fly across the world and take out Nasrat the way that he did was spectacular. It shows why he's one of the top fighters at lightweight. On top of that, what a Shark Tank of a division. We got the guys at the top there. We got Dan Hooker coming back in this fight, showing the length, using his arm reach, and then surprisingly using the wrestling. Nasrat jokingly said, well, I don't think it was a joke, actually. He's like, I thought there was an unwritten rule that we were going to stand and trade. But I agree with Dan Hooker in this case, where Dan Hooker replied and said, you were just staring at me. You weren't even doing anything. So I'm going to take you down. I'm going to take you to a place that you don't know as well as me. And for Dan Hooker to be using his wrestling like this is crazy. It opens the doors for a bunch of other stuff. To see some of the top ranked fighters at 155, they all have that wrestling background. Gaethje, Khabib when he was at the top, and even the champion now having his Brazilian jiu-jitsu skills, and Michael Chandler having his wrestling capabilities. A lot of those guys have that wrestling in their back pocket, and it's fun to see Dan Hooker pull it out. Just a couple more. Jalen Turner, always a big fan of his. Quickly, man, he reminds me of a John Jones at that lightweight division. So tall for that division, getting the rear naked choke. Great to see that. Always fun to see him fight. The whole card, it was a spectacular card, I think, especially with the cherry on top with the featherweight bout. What a way to end a card like that. UFC 266, one of those cards that is going to be up there when we reminisce. It's going to be it's going to be talked about of having one of the greatest featherweight bouts in UFC history. So thank you for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate it. You can listen to it on all the podcast platforms. If you're listening to it there, give it a like, review, 5 stars, all that good stuff. You're listening to it on YouTube, please comment below. Let's talk. Let's chat about this fight. I'm always interested to have a good discussion about these fights. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell notification, all that good stuff. Really helps out the channel. And again, thank you for listening. This has been the Body Punch Podcast. My name is Naz. Bye.